there's an interesting survey that finds that 62% of Americans are afraid to express some of their political opinions. That's an intriguing thought, particularly for this audience, most of whom consists of people who probably are not afraid of expressing their opinions that much. But we're joined by Joel Patterson. He is founder of the Vested Group online at thevested.com. What is that group, Mr. Patterson?
Good evening, Jim. We are a technology services provider that works with a business management system called NetSuite.
All right. With that, then, as a prologue, I certainly am not afraid to express my viewpoints. Goodness knows I'm paid to do so, 15 hours a week. But I have found that it is probably helpful to some of my relationships to temper some of my viewpoints. I'm not one to take, if you will, my show act and spew it everywhere. And I have a few family, mostly friends, with whom I have more or less reached an unspoken agreement to agree to disagree, that there is very little that can be really benefiting either party by getting into arguments that will solve nothing. If I thought, for example, that arguing with some family or friends would actually solve an issue, then I would say, well, it's worth it. But it won't. It'll merely make a Thanksgiving or a Christmas or whatever a less pleasant occurrence. And so I do find myself doing that, and quite frankly, I recommend it. And on more than one occasion, I have been at such gatherings when another person has begun to launch into a political conversation, and I have just spoken up and said, honestly, given who's here, I think it might be best if we talked about something else. I'll start by asking your thoughts about that aspect of this whole thing.
Well, I think everything that you said holds true for work conversation as well. There's really not a lot to be gained by having one of those conversations at the office. I mean, everything is so divisive these days. You can't have a sort of normal debate or even a passionate discussion around politics without offending someone. And really, when you're at the office, the goal is to get your job done, be a good colleague, support the culture, do the things that you're supposed to do. And unfortunately, the way things are right now, I don't know that you can necessarily do that at the office and still maintain the values and things that you want to. It's kind of sad, but even things as simple as being on a Zoom call and wearing a Trump or a Biden shirt, even if somebody doesn't say anything, chances are you've probably offended someone, and you don't want anybody leaving those calls feeling like they can't either say or feel a certain way. And so you're better off just avoiding it altogether.
I didn't even mention work, because I've always considered that kind of out of bounds. I mean, any working enterprise needs to build something that approaches teamwork, and to inject partisan politics even before the rabid partisanship of today entered into the picture always struck me as inappropriate, and quite frankly, a good way to possibly endanger your job. And I would have no argument with that. I don't think it has any place in a work system in which, unless of course you're working for the Democratic National Committee or the Republican National Committee or some purely partisan group, in which in that case politics may be in fact talking business. But at the general mill, run-of-the-mill type of employment, it strikes me as a really bad idea. And if employees are not smart enough to figure that out, then the employer, I think, needs to lay down the law rather forcefully.
Yeah, and the question comes down to should you have a policy about politics and whether or not it can be discussed at work? And it's unfortunate because you want to allow people to have their own opinions and to communicate those opinions, but like I was saying before, at work it's not a good place for it these days. And you mentioned the Cato Institute survey earlier. A couple of things that I want to point out on that were really surprising is the amount of people that feel like it is a fireable offense if you're found to be a Trump donor or a Biden donor. I mean, the fact that people feel like that just because of, and not even talking about politics at work, but just the fact that someone finds out that you donated to a certain party, they believe that it's okay to go ahead and fire that person regardless of their job performance. And to me, that's coming down to a discrimination or a bullying situation. I mean, we don't discriminate against race or gender or religion. How can you get to a point now where people feel like it's okay to do that on politics? It's a tough thing and a slippery slope for sure.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree. The idea of an individual self-censoring in the standpoint of just discretion around family, around friends, that's one thing. But the notion of this being used as a basis, and let's be quite blunt about this, almost every example we hear about has to do with people who support Donald Trump. They are the ones who are facing the discrimination. I have yet to hear of a single case of somebody facing problems at work because of the fact that they wore a Biden 2020 T-shirt. Now, it's always a "Make America Great Again," this type of thing. And I don't think that that's at all unfair to say that there is discrimination here, as you noted, but that it is very, very one-sided.
Yeah, and even in that survey, it said I think the number was 70% or so that considered themselves strongly liberal were more comfortable sharing their views on how they felt about the political contest underway right now. So you're right. And I mean, I had a situation a couple of days ago with my father-in-law where he was whispering under his breath who he did or didn't vote for last time, and didn't even want me to share that with his daughter. So if you're at that place with your family internally, getting there at work isn't hard to see.
Back with more with our guests, and we'll ask you folks out there again, people who listen to talk shows, not inclined to shall we say, hide their points of view. People who call in to talk shows, even less so. You do that hereabouts at 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. We are talking with Joel Patterson, founder of The Vested Group, online at thevested.com. And we're talking about this survey, which I'll go into in greater detail, finding 62% of Americans are afraid to express some of their political opinions. 1-866-50-JIMBO, and we'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to the Bohannon Show at 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. A new Cato Institute national survey finds that self-censorship is on the rise in the U.S. Again, nearly two-thirds, 62% of Americans say the political climate these days prevents them from saying things they believe because others might find them offensive. The share of Americans who self-censor has risen several points since 2017, when 58% of Americans agreed with this statement. These fears cross partisan lines. Majorities of Democrats, 52%, Independents, 59%, and Republicans, as our guest Joel Patterson noted, 77% all agree they have political opinions they are afraid to share. Strong liberals stand out as the only political group who feel they can't express themselves. Nearly 6 in 10, 58% of staunch liberals feel they can say what they believe. However, centrist liberals feel differently. A slim majority of liberals feel they have to self-censor, as do 64% of moderates and 77% of conservatives. So the issue certainly does come down to particular partisanship. Across demographic groups, nearly two-thirds of Latino Americans, 65%, and white Americans, 64%, and nearly half of African Americans, 49%, have political views they are afraid to share. Majorities of men, 65%, and women, 59%. People with incomes over $100,000 a year, 60%. People with incomes less than $20,000, 58%. People under 35, 55%, are afraid to express some of their political views, and over 65, it is 66%. Those who are religious, 71% feel this way. Non-religious, 56% feel this way. So again, the climate is not, shall we say, conducive. And while I agree that among family and friends, that it's probably sometimes a smart thing to do. One thing, Joel Patterson, that most depresses me and angers me is the extent to which free discussion on college campuses has been virtually stamped out, in some cases, not just by social pressure, peer pressure, if you will, but by the college pressure itself, enforced lack of candid conversation.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've been in college, but it doesn't surprise me to hear that. I mean, you mentioned the stat just a little bit ago about the fact that 44% of people under 30 believe that you can fire execs that are Trump donors. I mean, that's a pretty high number when you think that half of the people that are in college feel like you can fire somebody for that, and I assume they've got to go about that as the same way that we would in business, and making sure that we are leaning on core values and that we are thinking through the intent of why you feel that way or why you can or can't share those views. As long as your intent is clean, then I mean it's one thing. But if you're there to try to convince or change somebody's mind, it's really not going to happen, especially these days. I mean, it's so divisive that it almost creates a fight or flight kind of situation within people's minds.
Paul, let's be perfectly blunt about it. I don't think there's any question about why it is that many young people feel that way. For a couple of generations, we have abdicated our control of education, and these highly impressionable minds have, in many cases, been told that by faculty, which, shall we say, are something less than either friendly toward or familiar with the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting conversation for sure. We hire a lot of younger people to come in to our organization, and they don't have any business experience, and for us, they come in with certain views, and that's okay. We as an organization, we really want to embrace people's differing views. But because that's really what makes business run, right? I mean, if everybody thinks exactly the same way, your business isn't going anywhere. And so for us, it's important to embrace that, yet also create an environment that's safe for everyone and doesn't make people feel like they're standing out in the cold if they happen to disagree with someone else.
Starting with Frank in Cumberland, Maryland. Hello, Frank.
62% of Americans are afraid to express their opinions for two reasons. And I like to give examples of both. Number one is they're afraid they'll be punished. And a good example of that is Jimmy Carter. Usually an ex-president is invited to speak at the Democratic Convention, but not Jimmy Carter. He wrote a book called Peace Not Apartheid about Palestine, and he's been a non-person among the Democrats ever since. And the other example is it won't do any good if you express your opinion. A good example is those police officers in Minneapolis, Minnesota. There's a website that has printed a takeout from the Minneapolis Police Department training materials showing people training people to do exactly what those police officers did. Those police officers are innocent, and it's been on the website for 3 or 4 days now. No one has taken it up.
All right, well, let's let our guests respond to the basic points that you put forward here, Frank. There's a reason why these majorities of Americans feel this way. Joel Patterson, one, that they'll be punished, and two, it wouldn't do any good. Your thoughts?
Well, from a business perspective, I agree. I mean, it's not going to do any good when you're trying to promote an environment that is safe for everyone, and you're not necessarily going to convince someone to change their political views over a call these days that happens over Zoom. You really need to just table that for now and have those conversations elsewhere. I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Now, good evening.
Wayne from Columbus, Indiana, the hometown of Vice President Mike Pence, and this is a wonderful conversation you're having. Jim, I tend to agree with your position on the idea that if you be more conservative in certain work environments, it is hard to become clean, and versus if you're more progressive and liberal, it's okay, you get a free pass. And I look at, especially in the media and what have you, how some commentators treat liberal politicians versus conservative politicians. I mean, it's not rocket science. I mean, it's as clear as day. And I also agree that I think when you're at work, if there are places like your breaks, lunch breaks or 15-minute breaks or what have you, I think as long as it's done in a civil, respectful manner, I think it's okay to have political dialogue and political discussion. On a personal note, I work for a private family business, and the owner happens to be a local politician and on city council, and his politics is pretty obvious. But we have customers from across the political spectrum, and yet it's done in a very civil manner. It's done in a very civil, respectful manner. My boss makes no secret of his political leanings, and yet we try to have a fairly civil environment as far as doing business with our customers. We don't turn anyone away.
Yeah. Again, if it's okay with the boss, and you don't have a lot of deep partisan divides that are being expressed, that might possibly be okay. I want our guest to comment on that in a moment. But as we approach a break here, again, we're talking with Joel Patterson. He is the founder of the Vested Group online at thevested.com. And we're talking about a Cato Institute national survey finding self-censorship is on the rise in the United States, and that 62% of Americans say that they are afraid of saying some of their views. Back in a moment. Welcome back to the Jim Bohannon Show, 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. And we're talking with Joel Patterson, founder of the Vested Group, and talking about this Cato Institute survey, finding that 62% of us are frightened that we should express some of our political views. Now, Dwayne in Columbus, Indiana, had brought forward the notion that there might be times at work when that wouldn't be so bad. And I suppose it could be on a case-by-case basis. But I'd like your thoughts about that. I personally would probably tend not to at work unless I was talking with a like-minded individual and we were not part of a larger group or a group that, let's say, was likely to grow to include others of differing views. And again, in many cases, I may not know the views of my coworkers.
Yeah, Jim, I completely agree with you. I think in normal situations, unless it's just a one-on-one conversation, there's no one else in the room, I'd probably just avoid it and talk about the football game or something else. But really what this comes back to, and from a business perspective, is what your core values are and how you've developed your culture. You know, he had the example that his boss was actually a politician. So obviously their core values are probably going to be a little bit different than a lot of businesses. But at the end of the day, you've got to be able to lean on those values in times like this. I mean, you know, you look at everything going on these days with COVID, with social justice, with the election cycle. I mean, it all comes back to how you've developed your core values. Do you live by them? Do you actually talk about them on a day-to-day basis? Do you make hiring and firing decisions? And if you do, then you're probably going to be pretty well served in this time. The people are probably going to respect one another and have mutual trust and empathy for other positions. But if not, you're likely to find yourself in some trouble when people start having conversations that upset someone else, and then they go crying to the boss or you know, whatever method they take. You're going to have to deal with those situations.
Same call from Michael in Virginia Beach, Virginia, for our guest, Joel Patterson. Hello, Michael.
Good evening, Jim. Mr. Patterson, those statistics that Jim has been giving us, do you have those in front of you?
I do, yeah.
Okay. Well, now, there seems to be a vast difference between liberals and religious people. Now, Donald Trump's base is an evangelical base. It also consists of conservative Roman Catholics. So if this survey is accurate and to be believed, this group, Donald Trump's group, are living out what they've done for the last 100 years. They have sat silent in their churches, allowing one man to tell them everything that they should do, including not vote, not get involved.
Let's not get carried away here, Michael, with the specious stuff out of the middle of the clear blue sky. They're not sitting there waiting to be told what to do or not to do. These are simply people who, in their day-to-day lives, find a greater percentage of the time they would be uncomfortable expressing their views than those of some other groups. That there is a difference. Of course, the main distinction is drawn between liberals and conservatives, or religious and non-religious, but I'll grant you there's some overlap there. Joel Patterson, your thoughts?
Yeah, I really can't speak to the veracity of the actual survey. I do tend to agree with you in that it is skewed in one way or another, whether or not people are willing to even talk about it. But from a business perspective, I don't think a lot changes. It's really about how you've chosen to handle that internally within your culture and how you want to handle it going forward. And if you want to have a policy for it, another thing about this that we haven't discussed is, and it really comes into play a lot, is social media. I mean, how do you handle it? Yeah, maybe it's over a Zoom call where you've got some disruption, but what if it's social media based? And the thing is, employees already know that what they say on social media these days is even more important than what they say in a one-on-one conversation. And do you have a policy around that? Do you allow people to post on your behalf as an organization? I mean, those are questions you've got to work through to make sure that people are on the same page with what you're trying to push as an organization.
1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. As we turn to Doug in Avon, Minnesota. Hello, Doug.
Gentlemen, what scares me, I agree with you, Jim, that when I'm at work, I work for a major retailer, a world-renowned retailer, and we have a policy that you don't upset coworkers in that respect. But what scares me is anytime in the break room, a news channel is turned on, whether it's liberal or conservative, it's immediately turned off and they'll turn on some old rerun because it's innocuous and it offends no one. And then when you do talk to like-minded people, you can have these discussions privately. But if you get into more than 2 or 3 people where you're discussing anything politics related, a lot of them will just generally say, and it's all age groups, I just don't like politics at all, so I just don't get involved. I don't even want to hear about it. And those are the people that, if they do vote, are voting out of ignorance, and that just scares the bejeepers out of me.
Well, not necessarily. There are any number of people out there who may, in fact, be quite concerned about politics, care about politics, even be knowledgeable about politics, but they consider it to be a private activity. That's why you have limited participation in caucus states, because many people went to go to the polls and cast their vote in the privacy of the voting booth and not sit around in a room all night arguing with their neighbors. So, Joel Patterson.
Yeah, I actually consider myself one of those people, Jim. I don't like to discuss too much political activity at the office, but I do consider myself very well informed. I don't like to necessarily take my views from mainstream media, but I have a certain group of organizations that I trust and believe in, and I get several emails a morning that I consider myself very up to date on what's going on. But there's a lot of other things I'd rather talk about when I'm at work. Whether it's business related or even if it's personal, things that are going to allow me to develop relationships with people and allow me to further long-term contact with them and make sure that they're happy and engaged in their career rather than political discourse.
Welcome back to Jim Bohannon Show at 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626, as we talk with Joel Patterson, the founder of the Vested Group. And we talk about this Cato Institute National Survey that self-censorship is on the rise in the country. And again, this is hardly surprising to me. I must confess that the survey would seem to buttress my own personal non-specific observations. I haven't done any surveys as such, but I've seen this, I've felt this, and also it doesn't surprise me that, quite frankly, that liberal viewpoints are considered okay more than the conservative viewpoints. And I would even offer a rather partisan explanation for that. In my view, there is far greater tolerance of other views among conservatives than among today's liberals, and greater support for the First Amendment among today's conservatives and today's liberals. I think this is a relatively recent phenomenon, maybe over the past, say, 20 or 30 years. And we have seen it, I think, mostly on college campuses, but elsewhere as well. And it shows up in social media. Another example, major comedians like Seinfeld, Chris Rock. These are people who, in many cases, will no longer do college gigs. Jerry Seinfeld has said that, frankly, they won't accept any viewpoint that has been put forward, even if it's put forward to strike up a humorous chord or to bring about a discussion. That if they're offended, then that's the end of the conversation. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't. That's not surprising. It's disappointing, obviously, especially when it's coming from colleges where that's supposed to be the place where new thought is developed, right? And to know that we've gotten to that point, it's kind of a sad statement on where we are politically. But it's definitely indicative of the divisive world that we're in when it comes to a political conversation. Nobody seems to want to just be nice to each other. I hate to simplify it to that level, but it really feels like that. And again, that goes back to why, and from a business perspective, we've really got to make sure that we are most likely keeping that stuff completely out of the office and the water cooler talk.
A person who is by inclination litigious. However, it seems to me that in many of these cases, if we do not make something of a scene, maybe you feel you can't do it at work, but there are some circumstances where if you don't stand up and if necessary, even consider the possibility of using lawyers, then we're going to lose the First Amendment just by refusing to defend it. I mean, the wording might still be there in the Constitution, but it'll mean nothing. I mean, frankly, the people who push this notion that these little snowflake ears must be shielded from anything that challenges their preconceptions, that's utter nonsense, and is no way to either preserve a free society or prepare these people for the real world in supposedly leading this country into the dangerous middle of the 21st century. I really believe that if we just acquiesce in every circumstance, that we are going to lose a very precious freedom. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree that we can't always stand on the sidelines, whether we're talking about what's going on at work or elsewhere. I mean, it is important that we have the opportunity to stand up and say what we believe. This is a separate topic, but when you look at the social justice activities that have been going on lately, and for the longest time, CEOs and companies were not willing to say anything about that because they didn't want to offend a certain customer segment or employee segment, and that's starting to change. It has changed quite a bit, and politics and First Amendment. And I mean, I fully believe people should have the right to think whatever they want, no matter how crazy it might be. But we certainly want to make sure that at work, we aren't stirring things up unnecessarily, and remembering that we are there to earn a salary and get a job done, and not necessarily carry a banner for a political flag one way or another.
Jimbo, 1-866-505-4626. For Joel Patterson, we have a call from Bobby in Port St. Lucie, Florida. Good evening.
Hey, thank you, Jimbo. And yeah, naturally we're scared. We had Comey going after Trump, I think even before the election. We had, during the Obama administration, we had the IRS going after the Tea Party people. Yeah, we're scared. And guess what? You could put Obama stickers all over your house and your car. We're not going to touch it. Today, people are out of work. $1,000 worth of tires is a lot right now. So you keep your mouth shut, and then you vote.
Well, unfortunately, maybe a lot of us feel that way. Again, the voting part, by the way, and the secret ballot, that's vital. And regardless of whether you speak up or not, Joel Patterson, it certainly seems obvious to me that this is one of the most important elections probably in our lifetimes.
Yeah, hard to argue with that. On one hand, I'm really excited for it to get behind us so that we can focus on other things and get forward, or get on with figuring out what life is after COVID. But I also, I like the idea of just being quiet and voting. And one thing that we don't talk about a lot that I feel like is important is our local elections too. It's not just the presidential election. I mean, our local elections impact so much of what we do economically and socially. And we've got to make sure that we're keeping that stuff in front of us as well.
Absolutely. 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626 on the notion of whether or not you are frightened of expressing your opinions in some circumstances. Back in a moment. Jimbo, 1-866-505-4626. But I guess it's Joel Patterson, the founder of the Vested Group, and we're looking at the self-censorship that is common across the country. And it seems to me that again, we need to divide this, I guess, between how I would define it as a self-censorship of prudence on the one hand, that is to say, there's no point in me creating problems with family and friends, and that is to say, I self-censor not out of fear as much as just out of a desire not to endanger relationships. There's a difference between that and self-censorship based on fear, particularly in arenas where a robust conversation is important.
Yeah, it really, I think that self-censorship is kind of the key piece. The one way to really prevent these kind of awkward situations from happening is selecting and recruiting and hiring people that fit your company core values, that are believers in mutual respect and trust. And those things will never happen. I mean, if you try to come down on people after the conversation's already happened, you're kind of wasting your time. So you got to get ahead of it and live and breathe the culture that you want and you want to invest in, and make sure that those that you recruit believe the same way.
Are you an optimist about this? I must confess that I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I'm an optimist about this.
It's a good question. In general, my wife it drives her crazy how much of an optimist I am. Like, I think as a business owner, you have to be, but when it comes to politics, especially in business, yeah, I'm with you. It's really hard for me to find a silver lining here. The great thing about business is you can impact so much change in business, even more so than your churches or your communities, because you spend so much time together. And unfortunately, this really important event that's happening right in front of us is kind of off the table, and that's kind of sad. And but I don't see it changing anytime soon, unfortunately.
And that is unfortunate. Another unfortunate aspect of this is the fact that there are many good people who might well consider public service at the local, state, or national level, who simply don't. That they don't want any part of it. I've heard people say things, I don't want to get into politics. It's a dirty business, ignoring the fact that it is dirtier if clean people stay out of it.
Yeah, I had that exact conversation with my son yesterday, as a matter of fact, and I said the same thing. I've always been passionate about politics, and I find it fascinating, and I'd love to find a civil service like that where I can feel good about contributing to the community. But there is no way I would want to do that, and that is there aren't more people that are younger, that have fresh ideas, that don't seem to be tainted by the environment. And I don't know how we fix that. I know it needs to be fixed, and I hate bringing a problem without a potential solution, but it clearly is an issue for the day.
Yeah, again, a circumstance that needs to be changed. And one thing in particular, to the extent that this sort of thing is backed on college campuses, it's bad enough that happens at private institutions. But in many cases, suppression of speech is being done courtesy of your tax dollars to pay professors to do just that. Why in the world politicians don't hold the deans and chancellors of these state-supported institutions accountable and not give them one penny until they make reforms? I don't understand it. I know that politicians can be cowardly, but there's nothing brave about this. You'd pick up votes for standing up for free speech, I really believe.
Yeah, and you've got the same problem on the business side. The thing that I always wonder when big tech is getting hammered right now with what are they doing about some of the things that are put out there, and who makes that decision on what is or isn't acceptable? Sometimes it's obvious, right? But a lot of times it's kind of a fine line, and I don't know who actually decides whether or not something meets their standard. And where does that go? I mean, there's got to be some kind of path for that, because you do want to prevent some of the really inflammatory things from being out there, but I don't know what you do on the stuff that's a little bit closer to the line.
No, I honestly, I don't either. And I seek solutions, but I'm not sure. I only know that this is a crossroads time in the nation's history, and that there are some clear choices to be made between now and November, depending on whether or not you vote early or not. And those clear choices have a lot to do with some of the basic freedoms of this country. And again, I urge people, be sure that you are not afraid to speak out by means of your vote. Be sure that you are registered to vote, that your family is registered to vote, your friends are registered to vote, that if they don't vote early, that it comes time for the election. If Aunt Millie needs a ride to the polls, then you drive her to the polls. You do what you can. Never has been more important than it is today. Stay on the line and we'll speak off air. Joel Patterson is founder of the Vested Group, online at thevested.com. And we're looking at a survey from the Cato Institute finding almost 2/3 of Americans are afraid to express their political views sometimes, a discouraging and disquieting notion in these turbulent times. Stay with us, more to come. I'm Jim Bohannon, and this is Westwood One.